All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have got a number of things that I want to rant about. Hi, how you doing? My sidekick Dimitri here is going to be joining us because he just cannot be kept away from the esoteric metaphysics. He's literally addicted to it. He has a problem. We're working on getting an intervention going. But anyway, first thing I wanted to talk about, just because it's topical, and I'm sure you guys, just cannot get enough of this subject matter, which is the whole Epstein thing. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be reporting on that. If you're living under a rock, I'm sure there's not really much I can say about that whole thing that you haven't already heard, but I wanted to talk about this from a little bit of a psychological perspective first, and then we're going to get into some world historical archetypal gobbledygook. So, having taken a cursory glance at the fact that it, has turned out that all the most tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists among us were right about basically everything, and that our world is, in fact, owned and operated by a bunch of blood-sucking, reptilian, satanic pedophiles, you might be wondering something like, well, this is kind of weird, isn't it? Isn't it kind of weird, not only that all of these extremely powerful and well-connected individuals were into some really weird and messed up and highly deplorable stuff, but they all seem to have been into basically the exact same kind of weird, messed up, highly deplorable stuff. So, some people are probably going to try to kind of chalk this up to biology, right? That this is somehow just an inherent, deep, dark, buried aspect of the human id or what have you, that us normal people repress or whatever, and then if you're rich and powerful enough, you don't have to do that, and so it comes out. And I'm here to tell you that that's just not really what's going on here. So this is a very thankless task, trying to explain this very, very horrific subject matter. So whatever, here we go. So if you're a 55-year-old man and you look at a 17-year-old, for example, it actually is kind of biologically normal for some of the neurons within your primal monkey brain to activate and for you to think, oh, she is sexually attractive, okay? And then if you're a normal, well-adjusted, non-psychopathic Satanist, then the thing you do after that is you tell that part of your brain to shut up, and then you go about your day, and that's it. Right. So that, yeah, you could say that is biologically normal. But this whole thing, this is not that. This is not 55, 65-year-old men being attracted to 17, 18-year-old girls, or even, 15, 16-year-old girls, which is definitely pushing it in terms of what is even biologically explicable. No. What we're dealing with here is more along the lines of 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Okay. There are no neurons in your primal libidinal monkey brain that should be getting activated by that. And so for all of these rich weirdos to be into that specific kind of thing seems kind of weird, doesn't it? Why would they all be psychotic perverts in the same way? What is this? It's not biology, it's something else. So we're going to talk about what that something else is first and foremost. So the first thing we need to understand here is that there is something kind of fundamentally transgressive about sexuality itself. And this is this entire conversation is going to be a great example of why evolutionary psychology, the kind of neo-Darwinian evolutionary psychology you're going to get with, from someone like Steven Pinker, for example, is not terribly adequate for actually understanding how human beings operate, because it thinks of everything in terms of this kind of gene epidemiology game theory type of thing, which doesn't really take into consideration the formative dynamics, the motifs at play in all this, and how they operate. So, transgressiveness. Sexuality in general is something that is necessarily kind of transgressive insofar as it is about crossing boundaries, fundamentally. That is physically the case. It is also the case metaphysically. Sexuality is about taking the membrane which divides self and world and transgressing that boundary, blending, okay, the boundaries of those membranes, okay? As such, the transgressiveness of sexual acts can itself kind of contribute to that, insofar as you also have another kind of crossing of boundaries within transgressiveness. People tend to be into some kind of weird stuff in the bedroom, right? Things that they would generally not do out in public. This is why human beings tend to be into all kinds of sexual stuff that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense biologically, but psychologically it does make sense, because there is this kind of intensification that comes along with that, okay? As a result of that, if you are an extremely rich and powerful individual who is a hedonist, okay, who has made your whole life's mission about chasing greater and greater highs, then what's kind of inevitably going to happen here is that you're going to find yourself chasing greater and greater transgressiveness in order to further amplify that intensity of, let's say, sexual euphoria. Okay, so let's look at this actually from the angle of Greek tragedy again, because I love talking about this subject. And actually, this is a trope that you're going to see not just in Greek tragedy, but really throughout lots of different kinds of media, especially like horror films. You see this kind of thing a lot. But this thing where you've got like the breaking of seals. Okay, so in the Oresteia, for example, you've got the initial sacrifice of Iphigenia by Agamemnon, which is, itself kind of a callback to the age of Saturn worship and child sacrifice. And then you've got him walking on the scarlet tapestries, so that's the breaking of the second seal, the second taboo. And then finally you have the regicide of Clytemnestra actually murdering him. And actually, interestingly, it's actually like 4 seals in the Oresteia, because the 4th one is actually Orestes murdering Clytemnestra, the matricide. So that's interesting. But in any case, you break these seals, and then after the seals are broken, then all of this chthonic, or chthonic, as some people insist upon me pronouncing it, all this kind of libidinal, abyssal, infernal stuff, these primal spirits of rage and eros and whatnot come out to play, and you've officially crossed the threshold. If you're talking about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, the myth cycle, you've got these thresholds that are crossed. So the first threshold is crossing from the ordinary world into the supraordinary world. So this is that. This is you're breaking these seals. It is a specific kind of crossing the threshold from the ordinary into the supraordinary world, okay? And it's being done specifically in such a way that the seals being broken, the gates being crossed through, are breaking the order of the civilized diurnal world, the order of society, the order of normalcy in any kind of human civilized kind of sense. You see a slightly more tame version of this in Ishtar or Inanna, the queen of heaven within Sumerian mythology, right? She's got to cross through these gates into the underworld of Irkalla, and every step of the way she's kind of like undressing as she goes through those gates. So you've got a very similar kind of motif going on there. Another example of this would be like that film The Lighthouse, which is a great movie. You guys should totally watch it. Lots of really good symbolism in that film, but you've got something similar there where there are these taboos that are broken, and then finally the floodgates are open and everything gets super crazy. One of them is the killing of the seagull, right? Because the seagulls are said to be spirits of dead sailors or whatever, so that's the crossing of a taboo. And then Robert Pattinson's character, he accepts the booze from Willem Dafoe's character, and so that's like the final threshold that's crossed. And so anyway, that's the motif here, is you're breaking taboos as a way of kind of unleashing this primal, libidinal, Dionysian, Saturnian energy, right? So another thing worth mentioning here is the fact that all human sexuality is really a form of birth trauma reenactment. That's something most people don't want to talk about or think about because it's really uncomfortable, but it's definitely true. And even just from a purely physiological perspective, it's actually kind of obviously true when you think about it. There's this kind of inversion of the birthing process, right? The birthing process is the process by which the boundary between the human self and the world comes to be established, right? Okay, that initial membrane comes to form, and so you can think of the human psyche, the human ego, as this kind of matryoshka doll that's made of these layered shells, right? And so that's the formation of that innermost shell, the final threshold, as it were, between the nucleus of our identity and the world. And so that realm of that innermost shell is what we would call the id within Freudian psychology. You could also say that it is the modern equivalent of the magical structure, if you've been following along with my whole reconstruction of Jean Gebser's narrative within the ever-present origin, the structures of consciousness and whatnot. And so, as I already mentioned, sexuality is all about kind of breaking down the boundaries between self and world, because that boundary between the you and the not you is the source of our sense of existential anxiety, existential alienation from reality itself, from being itself. And that sense of existential anxiety, it's then kind of like a catapult being pulled back, and then it wants to go somewhere. It wants to resolve itself. It's like tension in music, right? A dissonant chord wants to resolve itself into something more consonant. If you have parts that are separate from one another, then they want to somehow harmonize with one another into some kind of greater whole. The human sense of sexual desire is that. So is our spiritualistic impulse. Those two things are not two separate things in two separate registers. They are actually kind of the same thing, believe it or not, which then tells you something about why all these satanic reptilian vampire pedophiles are all into this kind of weird cultic religious stuff as well. These two things go together, and they always have. And so this would have to be a whole other conversation, but then that makes it very interesting, doesn't it, that most religions throughout most of human history have valued some form of sexual asceticism. So chew on that one a bit. And then that whole thing about trauma reenactment then means that human sexuality is also very uncomfortably close to violence, because the birthing process is violent. It is absolutely horrifying. It is actually probably the closest any of us will ever come to death, other than when we actually die. For most of human history, that is actually the way that most human beings exited this world, is through the same canal that they were trying to enter it through. So, unsurprisingly, when we talk about kinky things in the bedroom, most of those things involve some kind of at least mock violence of some sort. And then when you're dealing with people who have a few screws loose, then that stops being so much a kind of theatrical thing and becomes more of like a very real thing. Of course, when you look at serial killers throughout the 20th century, and 19th, if we're considering like Jack the Ripper, who kind of established the serial killer archetype, you see this consistently. The desire to murder people was a libidinal impulse. It was sexually motivated, pretty much across the board for these figures. And then the final piece of the puzzle here is the fact that these techno-oligarch individuals are generally not atheist materialists, or if they are, it's not in your typical like Scientard, Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker kind of way, right? There's always this kind of a cultish inflection on it, even when they are as close as you can get to being atheist materialists. And honestly, I think it's always kind of been that way. I mean, this is a whole can of worms that we could crack open regarding the Knights Templars and the Freemasons, Jewish mysticism, and how that has always kind of been a part of these super oligarchical echelons of society. But the big picture here is that mechanistic materialism as an ideology seems to have never really been for the upper elites. They never really bought it. If you've ever went out into public and conversed with like regular people who aren't eggheads, you'll see that they never really bought it either. It seems to have always been an ideology tailor-made for the middle management. Perhaps there's some extent to which this was all orchestrated in a top-down kind of way by these shady individuals pulling on the marionette strings, but of course that's not necessarily the case. These things have a way of unfolding in ways that seem very purposive, just because that's how reality unfolds. And we'll see more of that as I continue to talk about these subjects. Things lock together in a way that feels very intentional, because there is a kind of intentionality there. But it's a kind of intelligence that is kind of all-pervasive, that permeates the archetypes and how they relate to one another, and psychological dynamics and the ideologies, the collective spirits, as it were, that move human populations and shape human cultures. These things are not stupid. In fact, oftentimes they tend to be a lot smarter than us, at least in certain ways. And so, one way or another, mechanistic materialism was kind of the perfect ideology for specifically the middle management, because it played in so perfectly with the overall ideological ethos of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? This idea of scientific progress and the progress of democracy, economic progress, the uplifting of all these savage people through education and hormonal birth control, and progress of science and the erection of the skyscrapers. And so then, as I was saying, at the top, you have people who have never fully bought into that. They have always been pretty woo-woo, it seems. And the kind of woo-woo that they're into, ironically, isn't terribly different than the Kool-Aid that I'm peddling here on Formscapes in a lot of ways. I mean, if you start looking into what the Freemasons and the Kabbalists and the Rosicrucians believe, at least the more benign, tame forms of those ideologies, it's not that different than what I'm preaching, right? They get a lot of things right for the most part. But there are some important differences, like the fact that the people at the top of that food chain believe themselves to be the Übermenschen, who are destined to bring about the new heaven and the new earth by basically reshaping the world into their image. They believe that morality in general is just kind of a construct, that they are above good and evil, and that they can do basically whatever they want. And that everyone else, we're just sheep, basically. And in fact, we should thank them, because really they're creating this new, better world for us. And what they're asking for is just to be able to satiate their deepest, darkest, most twisted psychopathic fantasies. Seems like a good deal, right? So being able to do that kind of thing is something that they can very easily rationalize philosophically, as it were. And because they have the infinite money trees at their disposal, they can do whatever they want and they can get away with it. They're above the law. They have no restrictions on the heights of euphoria that they can try to chase, and so that's what they do. And with all the pieces that I've put in place with the story thus far, we can see why, if you're in that position and that's what you're doing, then you're going to end up chasing kinds of transgression which are sexual and violent and which violate taboos, violate morality, violate normalcy in the most extreme ways possible, because that's the high that they're chasing. So you've got people who are into all kinds of super weird sexual psychopathic stuff. They're extremely rich, extremely powerful, involved in apparently an entire secretive world of these secret societies. And moreover, there's a kind of spiritualistic component to this, a kind of a cult component to this. And that component, as we will see, relates very heavily to Saturn. So that's going to be one of the major things I want to talk about in this video. So we're about to get into the more woo-woo side of this now. Alright, so with all of that said, now it's time to begin to get to the bigger picture. We're going to start really zooming out now, and so we got to switch gears just a tad. So the first thing I really need to put on the table here is this is going to seem like a very out of left field thing if you're new to this channel for sure, but it's going to be this. It's going to be that what Rudolf Steiner is calling the Atlantean epoch, and what Jean Gebser is calling the magical structure, and what the ancient Greeks are calling the golden age of Saturn, these are all the same thing. They are all referring to really the same phase of human history, of human consciousness evolution, which I believe probably corresponds to some period of time. I'm not exactly sure about the length. I have my speculations there as well, but let's just say it is a several thousand-year period, probably extending from the Neolithic Revolution back into prehistory. So essentially everything prior to the Neolithic Revolution. Now, in textbooks, in documentaries about anthropology, paleoanthropology, that kind of thing, you're going to get a very specific kind of caricaturized narrative about what human prehistory was like. Now, if you're confused as to why this is relevant to what I was talking about a minute ago, just bear with me. It'll all make sense eventually. But in any case, you're given this very caricaturized depiction of pre-civilized human beings as a bunch of hairy, smelly savages, right? Hunter-gatherers, small tribes, 100 to 150 people, right? And we're just wandering around, killing woolly mammoths with pointy sticks, that kind of thing, right? Now, if you listen to the alternative archaeology people, some of which I have a lot of respect for, incidentally, you'll get a very different narrative, but unfortunately one that I think is equally incorrect. They'll, give you the impression that prior to the Neolithic, prior to the Younger Dryas or what have you, human beings were, living in crystal spires, wearing togas and using, giant ether energy machines to fly around and create pyramids and things like that. And I don't think that's correct either. But nonetheless, I think what the alternative archaeology people do get right, an argument they make that is quite valid and quite correct, is that the standard textbook narrative seems to be very, very wrong, and there seems to be abundant evidence that that is the case. I mean, just looking to all of these giant megalithic structures like what we see with the pyramids, or with the megaliths of Malta, or Sacsayhuaman, or Machu Picchu, and so on and so forth. I mean, I could go on and on about these things. These people were organized in a way that went beyond what we see in modern hunter-gatherers. Because, again, we simplify things in I think some very misleading ways when we try to imagine that prior to the birth of agriculture, we were just doing that. We were doing hunting and gathering for several 100,000 years before somebody had the bright idea of putting some seeds in the ground and growing some wheat or barley or what have you. And I don't think that is the case. So, first thing to note here would be the way that the Greeks talk about the golden age of Saturn. This is really important, I believe. The Greeks talk about the golden age of Saturn as an age when there was really no differentiation between man and nature, at least in terms of what we now have, which is we now have a very human world on the one hand, civilization, right? And then you've got nature on the other, the natural world, the wilderness, which is not our world. It's its own thing, and our societies are their own things. There's a kind of membrane between us and the rest of the natural world. And during the Neolithic, you see this in very literal ways. You begin to see sedentary settlements that look a lot like cells, biological cells with cell walls, cell membranes. We literally start building walls separating us from nature. And what the Greeks are insinuating here is that prior to the Neolithic Revolution, that was not really the case. If you look to what Rudolf Steiner says about the Atlantean epoch, he says essentially the exact same thing, that we didn't really have cities or permanent settlements back then. Rather, we existed in such a way that we were kind of just interwoven seamlessly with nature. Instead, we only built things like temples and things like that. And this is exactly what we see when we look to the archaeological evidence. We find all these giant megalithic temples and things like that, but we don't find any giant megalithic cities or things like that. We don't see permanent settlements that are built in the same way that the pyramids or Machu Picchu were constructed. Now, if you want my full-blown analysis of this whole thing, then you can look to the alleged ever-present origin playlist here on the Formscapes YouTube channel, where I dive really deep into this kind of thing, especially within the first 2 episodes of that. But for now, the Spark Notes version of the story will do. So, essentially, the thing that we need to keep in mind here is that the human self, the human psyche, is a kind of layered matryoshka doll. You've got these kind of shells that are nested in one another. And when we're talking about this prehistoric phase of the evolution of human consciousness, which is really what this is, we're talking about the development of this kind of innermost membrane, right? And another thing we need to keep in mind here is the kind of ontogenetic principle and how that plays into all this. The way that ontogeny, so the development, the morphogenesis of a living organism or of the human mind, recapitulates its historical development, right? Even Carl Sagan suggested that he believed that that was the case in one of his books, incidentally. I'm just now remembering that for some reason. But in any case, this layer of our consciousness, which you could call the kind of Atlantean layer, which I think corresponds to the Freudian id. That's the kind of layer that we're talking about when we're looking at it from our modern perspective. We've got more layers built around it now, but this is also what Jean Gebser is calling the magical structure, right? And each of these layers of the human mind, they have their own characteristics, their own unique way of thinking, their own unique way of perceiving and conceptualizing reality. All things in our world, all living things, all organisms, all minds are made of layers. There are these distinct compositional layers which are essentially different organizational principles, okay? And the analogy with music is very useful here, as it always is. You start with just kind of a sine wave, let's say, okay? Just an unbroken hum, and that kind of corresponds to physical substances, physical material, the raw materials out of which stuff comes to be made, right? And then you start to break up that unbroken tone, and that gives you rhythm. And from there, you can then take rhythm, you can actually just increase the tempo, and then you can begin to form intervals, melodies, that kind of thing. So you have the physical substrate, the sound itself, and then you have the rhythmic layer, and then you have the melodic layer, and then above that you can get into things like chord progression, so you have a harmonic layer above that. And what I've tried to illustrate is that these compositional principles correspond to the elemental principles that we see in both Western and Eastern alchemy, these principles of water, earth, air, fire, etc. That's really what these guys are talking about. And they're using a language which for them would have seemed really obvious. It seems very cryptic to us because the way that we use language in the modern world is very, very different. We have truncated our use of language in such a way that we've created this boundary essentially between the literal and the metaphorical. So when I say I mean water literally, that means I'm talking about, the substance, H2O, the stuff that is in lakes and oceans. Any other kind of usage of the word water is then considered to be metaphorical. It's considered to be purely figurative or something like that. Pre-modern peoples did not think of it that way, right? When they talked about anger, to them that was fire, right? That was not a metaphor. That's just what the word fire meant. It had this much broader scope of meaning, okay, which encompassed lots of things that we would consider to be metaphorical, but for them it isn't really metaphorical because within the very idea of fire, you have this notion that fire itself is a formative principle that's not just something you see when you rub two sticks together, but rather something that actually pervades reality. And so it made a lot of sense for the ancients to say that Aries and Sagittarius are fire, that Mars is fiery, etc., etc. So now returning to the human self, the human mind, the human ego, what we're seeing when we look at the historical development of human consciousness, and again, this is something that I elaborate much more fully in that ever-present origin playlist. With each structure, you have the internalization of a subsequent organizational layer of the human organism into the human self, into that membrane that separates self from world. So a really great example of this, because we have so much archaeological and textual evidence for it, is what we see with Julian Jaynes and his narrative about the whole bicameral mind thing. Now, I very much disagree with what Julian Jaynes believes that he's seeing when he looks at this major transition within the Bronze Age, but nonetheless, he's seeing something very real there, and I believe it's this. It is the internalization of the inner voices, the voices that we hear in our minds, into the human ego, into the human self, okay, in such a way that those voices feel like something that we are doing rather than something that is happening to us. Prior to the late Bronze Age, the notion of internal thought is something you just don't see at all. You only see references to the voices of the gods, the voices of the ancestors, and then this transition begins to take place around the time that Karl Jaspers would have referred to as the Axial Age. And so, again, you can kind of zoom this out and then look at these different stages of the evolution of the human self in such a way that each phase is the internalization of yet another one of these principles. So now, if we look back to the Paleolithic then, to this Atlantean or Golden Age of Saturn type epoch, we're seeing an age where really the human self is identified with what we could call the life body, okay? The metabolic layer of our existence. And again, if you look at pre-civilized forms of human culture, forms of human spirituality, one thing you very often find is that they will say that the human soul, the human spirit, is localized within the gut, within the viscera, or within the bodily fluids, specifically blood and semen. You see a vestige of this, or a holdover of it, in Sumerian mythology, with this idea that the world essentially consists of this overlap between these two metaphysical oceans. You have this kind of celestial ocean above, associated with fresh water and semen, and then you have this abyssal, primordial, chthonic ocean beneath us, which is associated with salt water or blood. Now, following the end of this Atlantean, antediluvian epoch in the beginning of the Neolithic, we're going to see a transition occurring where you have the internalization of what I've called the sentient body, the sentient layer of the human composition. And this, if you look into these kind of esoteric traditions, you'll see this referred to as the astral body. And so what essentially this is the layer of our composition, which consists of drives, emotions, impulses, the kind of thing that we share in common with animals. That's the way that Steiner describes it. So human beings have internalized the astral body, let's say, the sentient principle, into our organism, our biology, in the same way that animals have. Okay, but plants have not. With plants, that principle, which corresponds to elemental air, is something that is still external to the organism for plants and fungi. So the internalization of that principle into the biological organism, that's the transition from flora to fauna, okay? And then the internalization of that principle into the human ego is what we see in this diluvian transition, as it were, from the Paleolithic to what we would think of as civilization, sedentary life, agriculture, that kind of thing. And that's a very big transition, and it matters in lots of ways because, as I've already alluded to, this is going to completely reshape the way that we perceive reality overall. And it's going to completely change the way that we think. It's going to completely change spirituality. And by understanding that contrast, by understanding the difference between human beings on either side of that divide, we can really start to get a sense of what human consciousness and, by extension, human society was like prior to the beginning of really history as we know it. So it's really after the beginning of the Neolithic, the end of the Atlantean and the beginning of civilization, that we begin to see the development of abstract symbolism. Prior to that, what we see is a much more pictographic form of human thought. Okay, and so I think this in itself is a good reason to think that the pyramids and much of the things that we associate with Egyptian civilization is significantly older than what archaeologists would have us believe, because when we look to the hieroglyphics, what we're seeing is something transitional, something that was originally quite clearly very much pictographic in essence, that over time began to become something more like an abstract symbolic alphabet. And so when we look to ancient Sumeria, I think what we're seeing is a much later development with cuneiform, right? Because then you just have these dashes and dots that are supposed to represent sounds, which then represent ideas, which then correspond to things in the world. There's many steps of removal here then between the ideational, the conceptual, and then concrete bodily reality. With pictographic thinking, you have something that is much less mediated. You have images which correspond directly to things that are actually out there in the world, perceivable directly by the human senses. And this really indicates what really the big difference is here between magical thinking, magical consciousness, and mythical consciousness. And here I'm using the language of Jean Gebser, okay? So the magical Atlantean consciousness, it's pictographic. And so that means the ideas, if you can even call them that, correspond to specific concrete things, whereas within mythical consciousness, that's when you can begin to really have veneration of universals, of abstractions as gods, okay, in a way that we would understand today. So just to give an example of this, in this truly magical shamanic mode of consciousness, let's say like a storm happens. A storm comes through and destroys a bunch of things, okay? Within that magical, pictographic, Atlantean mode of perceiving reality, you would say that spirits, storm spirits, or spirits of lightning and wind were responsible for doing that, okay? And these spirits are not abstract universals. They are not these beings that govern all storms in general, okay? You have very specific entities which are there in that storm, in that wind, right? Whereas within the more mythical, post-Diluvian mode of consciousness, you would attribute that to this kind of universal principle, okay? So if the river overflows, then mythical consciousness would attribute that to maybe a god of rivers in general, or a god of fresh water in general, or something like that. Whereas this more magical shamanic way of thinking, instead you would have like a specific identity attributed to that specific river itself. Okay, so that river itself would actually have a name. It would be considered to be a spiritual being in its own right. And of course, you do have overlap between these. In many cultures, you do see both this kind of magical mode of perception and the mythical mode of perception overlapping, but nonetheless, we can see that there is a qualitative distinction here, and that this transition occurred historically over a specific period of time. So just to recap a bit, what you've got here is a number of different compositional strata, compositional layers, very much like what we see in music, right? You've got tone and then rhythm and then melody and then chord progressions, harmonic motion, that kind of thing. You have something very similar, really just throughout nature in general. And so when we look to biological taxa, what we're seeing is the internalization of these different principles into biological organisms, into the actual bodies of living beings. So with plants, you have the internalization of this etheric or morphic principle, this principle that shapes biological bodies into coherent forms. When you look to the world of minerals or material substances, things like, liquid water, H2O, or even like rocks, marble, that kind of thing, you don't have the internalization of that morphic principle, all right? So that's why you can take a block of marble and you can carve it into a statue of David, right? Because that block of marble, it's kind of like a fluid in a sense. Even though it's solid, it doesn't have its own form that it's trying to maintain, really. You can't carve an elephant into a statue of David because the elephant has that morphic principle internalized in such a way that it is trying to maintain its elephantness. The marble doesn't care what shape it's in, right? That morphogenetic, physiomorphic, physiology shaping principle is not internalized within these mineral or material substances, which is why with our physical bodies, we have all of these different substances, right? Like carbon, oxygen, magnesium, and these substances can kind of just flow in and out of the organism because they have this kind of liquid-like quality, which is a lack of that morphic principle. So then with animals, you have the internalization of this sentient or astral principle, which is about motion and behavior, right? Which is why animals get up and move around and hunt and do things like that. And plants and corals and whatnot don't do that. And then with human beings, we are rather unique in the sense that the principle that we have internalized is subjectivity, the I, right? And so this is a whole can of worms. This is something I've talked about rather extensively in other videos, so I'm not going to harp on it here. But then when we look to human history, what we're seeing is the internalization of these different compositional levels into the ego itself. So when one of these layers is within the human ego, when it's internalized, it feels like something that we are doing of our own voluntary agency, right? It is something that we feel to be coming from the self, from our sense of freedom, really. And when it's outside, when it's externalized, it instead feels like something that is happening to us externally, right? So again, if we look to Julian Jaynes, what we're seeing there in that Bronze Age, Axial Age transition is a transition where the inner voices come to be experienced as something that we're actually doing, something that is actually coming from us rather than something that is happening from the outside, which is why when we look to any kind of literature, any kind of writing prior to that late Bronze Age era transition, you don't see anything about thought in the way that we would think of it in the modern world as like this inner monologue that we feel to be coming from inside of us. Rather, that kind of dialogue is experienced as the voices of the ancestors or the gods. It doesn't feel like something that's coming from within us. It feels like it's coming from the outside, right? So back up a little bit. I'm not really talking about that transition in the late Bronze Age, but rather an earlier transition where what we are internalizing is this sentient or astral principle, right? And so this is going further back. We're going deeper into human history, deeper into the history of the evolution of the human subject, human egoity, let's say. Prior to this internalization of that sentient astral principle, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that the behavioral principles, the forces which move us in terms of drives and impulses and emotions would be experienced as something happening to us, something that was kind of coming into us from the outside, right? And this might initially seem like something very strange and alien that I'm suggesting here, but this is actually something that we can still experience even today. If you've ever been to a sporting event or a rock concert, or if you're a very strange person who has participated in some kind of, like mob violence or riot, these are situations in which we kind of regress, in a sense, back into this magical mode of consciousness. Magical is the way that Jean Gebser would put it. And within these situations, you can see that there are still circumstances in which our sense of individual agency can be kind of turned off to such an extent that we feel ourselves to just be kind of moved by this collective spirit, as it were. And one really important detail in all of this is that you have a kind of boundary here, okay? You've got this boundary between this magical, abyssal stage of human consciousness, this abyssal or chthonic layer of the human organism, the human subtle body, let's say. And that boundary, as we'll see, is really represented by Saturn, and we'll get to that. But what I want to mention here first and foremost is that boundary is also the boundary between a much more collectivistic sense of human identity, human existence, and then the more individualistic sense of the human being as really a kind of individual soul. It's only once that sentient principle is internalized, it's only once we feel that the forces moving us are being issued forth from within our own selfhood that we really can even begin to experience ourselves at all as individual entities, as a self-concept which can be something independent from the tribe, from blood and soil, that kind of thing, right? So when we look at any kind of magical practices, shamanic, animistic practices, or even these much more dark, kind of occult, ritualistic things and whatnot, there are a lot of common themes. One of the common themes is a focus on Saturn, and then on the other hand, Dionysus. There's a reason for that, and it's because both of those, and in fact, I would say really all of the deities represented by the outer planets, so Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, all of these represent boundaries in different kinds of ways. And so for Saturn and Pluto, Saturn really represents the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious, right? Because Saturn is all about necessity. It's all about determination, about fate, about things that happen in this kind of mechanical sort of way. It is time, but time specifically in the sense of the way that the past kind of conditions the future, the way that it truncates future possibilities and necessitates what the next moment has to be, right? So this is also why Saturn is associated with karma within Indic philosophy, within Western esotericism, within astrology, that kind of thing, right? So the conscious world is a world where you kind of have this voluntary executive control. You have options, and your consciousness is there to choose between those different options, right? You, in your ordinary experience of just being in the world in a waking, lucid state, is an experience where you've constantly got this field of possibilities which you are actively navigating in this kind of executive way. But then take, for example, riding a bike. When you're first learning to ride a bike, it is a nightmare because you're having to think about all of the different things that you're doing, and your executive voluntary control over what's happening is very thorough. You're having to really be there, as it were, for all of the different motions and whatnot. You know, so think about like a centipede. If a centipede had to think about all of its individual legs, then it wouldn't be able to walk. Those things kind of need to be automated. And so as you learn to ride a bike, all of those different little micro decisions start kind of being made automatically. They kind of sink down into the unconscious as they solidify, as they concretize. So a kind of determinacy is achieved there, where there's no longer a field of options that you're selecting from. Rather, your body just kind of knows which option to pick in terms of, which way to lean your body or how hard to push on the pedals and that sort of thing, right? So then when we look to the archetype of Pluto, which really embodies Charon and Dionysus and Hades, what we're seeing is a different kind of boundary, the boundary between self and world, right? So this is something I've talked about previously in other videos where I talked about the way that Pluto kind of corresponds to this phase really the final phase in the biological birthing process, right? So when I talked about Stanislav Grof and his whole perinatal matrix thing and the whole birth trauma thing, Pluto really corresponds to the phase in which the infant is born, the foramen ovale closes, the infant's respiratory and circulatory systems come to be self-enclosed into kind of a self-contained system, which is now independent from the mother, independent from the external world. For that reason, then, what Pluto is really about, it's about that gap between self and other, subjectivity and alterity. And this is why that Plutonic archetype contains all of these things like sexuality and anxiety and paranoia and fear and violence, like all of this primal stuff. All of those things kind of emerge directly out of that feeling of separation from the world, because that feeling of separation itself is a kind of anxiety that then wants to resolve itself somehow. On the one hand, that sense of separation is a kind of fear that you will be dissolved back into the world, that you will be eaten up by it, as it were, and that you will lose your subjectivity, your selfhood, which delineates you from the world. And on the other hand, there's also this desire to, paradoxically, to merge back into the world, and that's really the source of our libidinal and sexual impulses, and also our spiritualistic impulses. Those are not two separate things. They're two sides of the same coin, in the exact same way that sexuality and violence are, as uncomfortable as it is, also two sides of the same coin. And all of that is really contained here within that Plutonic archetype. So now it's time to switch gears a bit and talk about the astrological angle on all this. And in particular, one of the most important things going on right now is this conjunction of Saturn and Neptune at the cusp of Pisces and Aries, which is a pretty big deal for all kinds of reasons. And really, we've got a number of really big currents, as it were, really big waves that are all kind of synchronizing at the same time right now. So something I talked about in a couple of previous videos was the Pluto and Aquarius cycle, where the ingression of Pluto into Aquarius, the transiting of Pluto through Aquarius, has historically been associated with these very major transitions within culture and politics and philosophy and technology. And we are now in another age of Pluto and Aquarius. And so Pluto, as I've said, is really about alienation. It's about separation from the comforting maternal safety of whatever we're embedded in, right? So on the biological level, that is quite literally the infant's body becoming a kind of independent system from the mother. At the level of this astrological stage, Pluto and Aquarius then is going to be about the separation of human beings, the alienation of human beings from our culture, really, from the safety and envelopment of the life world that we are embedded in. And so when we look to these Pluto Aquarius phases of history, like the late 18th century, for example, it's not just that there's this acceleration of social and cultural and technological scientific development. It's specifically that these are developments which further the separation of the modern human being from that paternal/maternal womb, as it were, that is pre-modernity, the pre-modern life world. So in the last video essay, for example, I talked about this with regards to Don Quixote and the way that that really represents this separation, this alienation from the pre-modern myth, the collective myth of medieval Christendom, right? And so in the late 18th century, you see this with all these developments in terms of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the development of modern democracy, Kant's critique of pure reason, the beginnings of German idealism in general, the birth of modern electrical technology. All of these things began during that time period, okay? And with Pluto and Aquarius right now, we're seeing something very similar with artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is, first of all, a complete misnomer, in my opinion, but its major impact thus far has been facilitating this mistrust of everything, this complete divorcing from culture, the socio-political world that we're embedded in. There's this sense that it's all just a big lie and you can't really trust anything anymore, right? And that is very Pluto and Aquarius coded, or Pluto in Aquarius coded. Now, this is a little bit tangential, but nonetheless, this Pluto and Aquarius thing is also a really great example of the fact that astrology actually can have a predictive value in certain regards. Pluto initially ingressed into Aquarius in March of 2023, so quite a while back. And it was only in Aquarius for, I believe, a couple of weeks. But during that brief period of time before it retrograded back into Capricorn, we had a number of things happening within the world of artificial intelligence. And keep in mind, this was really before artificial intelligence came to really blow up in the way that it did subsequently. But we had a number of things there. There was a new version of Midjourney, I believe, that was released, and there was a number of different new models of these AI programs that were announced or released, and then there was this giant NVIDIA conference about artificial intelligence, and so there were a number of things that all happened within that specific window of time that kind of foreshadowed what was to come. If you were paying attention to that, you were like, okay, so that is showing us one of the major motifs that will characterize this period of Pluto and Aquarius that we're about to enter into. Then, in addition to that Pluto and Aquarius cycle, we've also got this Uranus and Gemini cycle, which historically has been very closely associated with the United States, and specifically transformations in the self-identity of the United States, right? So if you go back through history, you have Uranus in Gemini within the Second World War, within the American Civil War, and in the founding of the United States itself. And so this is a big deal because these events are not just major events. They're not just like major wars, for example. So World War I, for example, did not occur within a Uranus and Gemini period. But World War II is significant in a way that World War I is not, because of the way that World War II really transformed the self-identity, the collective soul, as it were, of the United States, the way that it completely reconfigured the United States in terms of how we see ourselves in relation to the rest of the world, what we think the mission, the destiny of the United States is supposed to be. Rewinding back to the Civil War, there's little exposition needed for that. Obviously, you have these issues of the relationship between state and federal power, and then you've also got the racial tensions within the United States, which are obviously a big deal, and even that in itself is very Gemini, right? Gemini is all about kind of holding separate things in relation to one another, reflecting one another, right? And so obviously you see that within the racial divide within the United States, primarily between black and white Americans. And this is another thing that I mentioned in one of the last videos. There's this really great symbolic studies video. If you guys haven't seen that channel, it's really good, but it's a very brief video, but it goes over all of the Gemini symbolism that surrounded the George Floyd thing. And so that's very interesting as well. George Floyd himself was an identical twin, first of all, and then you had all of this stuff surrounding, of course, racial problems. And so that you've got this kind of like duality where things are being brought into confrontation with one another in this very Gemini kind of way. And then if you look back to September 11th, the September 11th terrorist attacks, you've got the Twin Towers, right? Now that didn't occur during a Uranus and Gemini period, but nonetheless, it's another illustration of how deeply encoded Gemini symbolism is with the soul of the United States. But perhaps the most significant Gemini-coded aspect of the United States is the contrast, the duality between the two culture forms which really constitute the United States as an entity. So again, this is something I've talked about in the last unscripted video, right? I talked about Oswald Spengler and this notion of cultural pseudomorphosis, where you have what is really a kind of external alien culture form, which is imposed on top of the culture form, which is actually native to a given geographical region. So with the United States, you have the American empire, as it were, the skyscrapers, the battleships and everything, the federal government of the United States, and the culture of this kind of high elite, as it were. And then you have the boots in the soil, Arcadian, more parochial culture of the common man within America. And those are two completely different cultures. And that is not just a quantitative difference, right? There's actually a significant qualitative difference here. And this is something that we don't see everywhere, right? Like there is a difference between the kind of posh upper echelons of British culture, for example, and then you have the lower class kind of ordinary culture of ordinary British people. Yes, there is a difference there, but nonetheless, British culture, top to bottom, still shares the same core motif. The same core form language informs British culture at all socioeconomic levels. With the United States, that is not the case, right? And with Russia, that is also not the case. You actually have a qualitative difference between the top and the bottom because you have two completely different form languages at work. So, with the top of the United States, with that elite oligarchy, the federal government, the American empire, and so forth, what you really have is a kind of vestige of Faustian civilization. And the core of Faustian civilization really began in Germany and then also Britain. You have this core motif, which is the spire, okay? That is the Ur phenomenon, the Ur symbol, as Oswald Spengler would say, of Faustian civilization. And here in America, we see that in the skyscrapers and the Twin Towers and the Saturn V rockets, right? That's the core of that form language, but it's not actually native to the United States. And this is something that's very important to understand here. This is something that Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung both pointed out, the way that the soul of a people is very much related to the soil that they walk upon. There's something about a given geographical region which really changes people. It really changes the way that a culture comes to develop and unfold. And so what I would say here is that for whatever reason, these or symbols or motifs that Spengler talks about, these things are localized, generally speaking, to a certain geographical region. A certain biome is kind of the container of that nucleus. So I'd probably say that Faustian civilization really begins, it really gets going around the time of the Italian Renaissance and or the 30 Years' War, and it's also right around that time period that we have the second to last Pluto in Aquarius period. Okay, and so the Faustian core motif, as I said, is the spire. And so this begins as the spire that we see within the Gothic cathedrals, right? So you've got this singular spire pointing upward, and you can see that this is a mutation, a metamorphosis of the columns that we see within Greek architecture, right? So with Greek architecture, with the Greek temple, you have this phalanx of these columns, these phallic symbols, which are enclosing and holding up the temple and protecting the inner adytum, which is the feminine principle, right? And so with the Gothic spire, the Gothic cathedral spires, this has been kind of condensed down, let's say, into a singular upward trajectory, which really represents a will towards the transcendent, a will towards achieving union with the Christian God, right? And the spire represents then the way that this unified will towards transcendence unifies the culture, unifies the people. They are all brought together by this singular upward turn towards the heavens and towards the monotheistic Christian God, right? And so as that core Faustian spire motif then itself undergoes a metamorphosis, we see it change into what we see in Big Ben, the clock tower, right? And then the Eiffel Tower, which represent this kind of technologization of that motif. And then, of course, with the Saturn V rockets or any kind of space rockets, you have something very similar here where you still have this unifying will towards the transcendent, but now the transcendent is no longer something metaphysical. It's no longer something theological, at least not explicitly, but now it's taken on this form where it is this will to explore space, right? The outer space, as though outer space were just a new form of the ocean, which was explored by Faustian civilization with the Age of Sail, with the British ships of the line and their masts, right? That's another example of this spire motif, right? So the same civilizational form, the same form language can be expressed in a variety of different nations within a given phase of historical development. And so here we need to bring in another distinction, borrowed yet again from Oswald Spengler, between what you could call the nuclear nation. Okay, so the nation that is kind of the nucleus of a given civilization, a given form language. And then on the other hand, the universalistic empire, right? So with the Greeks, for example, Greek civilization per se, so the Hellenistic nations, city-states, represent this kind of nucleus of what Oswald Spengler would call Apollonian civilization, so Hellenistic civilization, really. And then you have the Roman Empire, which is the kind of universalistic empire, where one of the core motifs is the metropolis, the kind of world city. And so all of the development, all of the elaboration and forward progress of the form language is really going to occur within that nucleus nation, okay? And then that's going to be taken up by the universal empire, and that universal empire is then going to kind of spread that out over the world as it tries to expand and really take those core motifs and developments to their ultimate logical conclusion. So another example of this would be Islamic civilization. The nuclear nation of Islamic civilization was the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, and it was really Baghdad that was the centerpiece of the golden age of Islamic civilization. And then the Ottoman Empire is the universal empire of that same core form language. So for Faustian civilization, then the nuclear nation of Faustian civilization would be Germany. So Germany is where we have really all of the major philosophical developments within the modern age: Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Karl Marx, also the development of psychoanalysis with Freud and Carl Jung. You also have these artistic movements like German Expressionism, for example, and also modern physics. The central hub of modern physics, certainly during the 19th century, was Germany. And then the British Empire is the universal empire of Faustian civilization. And so a really interesting detail to note is the way that all of this kind of lines up with the zodiacal ages. So this is something you guys are probably familiar with. You've got the precession of the equinoxes, and then the position of the sun moves through the zodiac over the course of these kind of 2,000-year-long phases. So you've got an age of Aries, an age of Pisces, age of Aquarius. But what's interesting here is that if you actually look at these zodiacal ages as kind of split, such that the first 1,000 years corresponds to where the sun is rising during the equinox, and the second 1,000 years as where the sun is moving towards. And then you end up with this kind of back and forth pattern, right? Which traces out this big dodecagram, I suppose you'd call it. So what that means then is that with the age of Aries, you would actually have the first 1,000 years constituting the age of Aries, and then the second 1,000 years constituting the age of Libra. And it's during that second 1,000-year stretch that you have this axial age. The development of the Greek Golden Age occurs during this period. The development of Socratic philosophy and pre-Socratic philosophy and Aristotelianism, all of this occurs within this age of Libra. Okay, now that's significant then if you watched my video, The Invisionary Ego, the Soul of the Future, the last long-form video essay. I talked about the way that the functioning of the left cerebral hemisphere, this kind of discursive mode of thinking and perception, is really embodied within the goddess Athena. And this Athena archetype is what we see in really both Virgo and Libra. And so that's significant then, right? Because the next zodiacal age, the first 1,000 years after Christ, that's going to be the age of Pisces, right? Where we're going to see this major turn towards inner experience for human beings, right? So a really great example of this would be the Apostle Paul and his conversion experience. Paul did not convert to Christianity because he had been in some kind of philosophical debate, or because he read some kind of metaphysical treatise, or because his people were conquered by a foreign empire that imposed Christianity upon them. No, it was a private, personal, inner experience, right? And so Paul's conversion experience and, of course, the life of Christ, both of these are really indicative of this age of Pisces, which constitutes the first 1,000 years of the Common Era, right? And so then the next 1,000 years would be the age of Virgo. And so Virgo is also associated with this kind of Athena archetype, right? It is about prudence and discernment, right? It's this very kind of practical, pragmatic way of approaching reality. It's also a mercurial sign, whereas Libra is Venusian, Virgo is mercurial, and that's very significant here because Faustian civilization is in many ways rooted in Norse Germanic civilization, where the Allfather, the king of the gods, is not Saturn or Jupiter, but rather their equivalent of Mercury. If you look to Odin and look at the way that Odin expresses this archetype, it's actually quite blatant. He's this kind of wandering wizard, right? Very much akin to figures like Hermes Trismegistus or even Moses in certain regards. And so that's going to be very significant here because then we can see that there is a kind of recapitulation happening here where you've got these core motifs which are really associated very heavily with the human left cerebral hemisphere. They're being developed initially within the golden age of Hellenic civilization, and then you go through this period where there's kind of a detour, and then these motifs come back and are re-elaborated, recontextualized with the golden age of Germanic civilization, which is really Faustian civilization. And so a really fantastic illustration of this would be what we find in Friedrich Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche is looking at the Hellenic Golden Age and specifically the development of the art form of Greek tragedy. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of read between the lines here and see that Nietzsche is drawing this parallel between Greek tragedy and the developing art forms that are happening in Germany at the time. This is a time period where he was very closely associated with Richard Wagner. And so he's essentially looking at it as though you had the development of Hellenistic tragedy as the expression of this synthesis of these Apollonian and Dionysian forces. And then civilization kind of goes into this period of decadence, which he associates with Platonism and subsequently Christianity. And then he sees this kind of resurgence happening, this revivification of that syzygy of Apollonian and Dionysian forces in Germany during this time period. And now, of course, later on, Nietzsche is going to come to see things very differently. He's going to have a falling out with Wagner and become very disillusioned with really Germany itself, especially German nationalism, but that is a whole other story. In any case, what I'm getting at here is that while Germany represents the nucleus of Faustian civilization, while the British Empire represents the universal empire of Faustian civilization, with America, with the United States, we actually have a third thing, which is quite different. So the first important thing to note here is that American Faustianism is not native to the Americas at all. It's a kind of foreign import. It's something that we see within the skyscrapers and the Saturn V rockets and within Washington and the economic financier oligarchs and so forth, but it's really not the same thing as the form language of the ordinary American people. And the disconnect between those two things has always been very acute, and it is becoming more and more acute over time. American Faustianism is not a universal empire. It's more like an attempt to revivify the universal empire following the collapse of the British Empire. But what's important here is that the core motif, the core essence of Faustianism within the American Empire has mutated into really its most undead vampiric form. With Big Ben, for example, in London, you have this symbolism of discernment and rationality and prudence in this very kind of left brain, calculative sort of way that is held above the city by the tower, the phallus, right? And then that ordering of the clockwork is that which imposes order upon chaos, essentially. But then if you look over to New York and those skyscrapers, you have something very different. Well, first of all, it's a multiplicity of skyscrapers. And these skyscrapers really represent this very individualistic, very entrepreneurial form of pragmatism, right? You have this fantasy of being at the top of your big skyscraper with all of your money and wealth and power and kind of surveying your kingdom that you've carved out through this very American form of industrial and post-industrial entrepreneurship, right? What we're seeing here is the mutation of that Faustian soul into its most perverse form, in which the will to transcendence takes on this very cutthroat, narcissistic, capitalistic sort of form. And ultimately, of course, that is fundamentally unsustainable because there's no real way that that kind of core motif can actually bring a people together. There's no way that that can actually form the basis of a stable nation at all, let alone an empire. So now let's zoom out and look at what is happening currently in terms of the evolution and dynamics of these archetypes. So we've got Uranus and Gemini signifying a drastic reconfiguration of the soul, the self-identity of the United States. And then we've also got a pair of eclipses which are happening right now. We've got a solar eclipse, which is happening in Aquarius, and then a corresponding lunar eclipse, which is happening in Virgo. And so that in itself is indicating something related to this transition from an age of Virgo / Pisces to an age of Aquarius. And then we've also got this conjunction of Saturn and Neptune at the cusp of Pisces and Aries at 0 degrees Aries. And that Saturn-Neptune conjunction is very significant here as well. Chris Brennan from the Astrology podcast, he recently released a video which was specifically about the way that if we look to these Saturn-Neptune conjunctions over the course of history, we see that these conjunctions always coincide with very important happenings related to secret societies. Right, so things related to the Knights Templar, for example. And then you've also got this overarching motif of popular uprisings. So the Saturn-Neptune cycle has historically been very closely associated with big developments within communism and Marxism, especially during the 20th century, and also with Marx himself during the 19th century. Overall, you've got these motifs of hiddenness associated with Neptune, of course, and then these motifs associated with big overarching power structures or societies, right, associated with Saturn. So secret, Neptune, society, Saturn, right? These things are usually pretty on the nose, frankly. So we can see that what's happening right now with this whole Epstein debacle and so forth really encodes everything that is happening right now in terms of the transition that we are currently moving through. So you have this immense mass disillusionment with the elites, with our entire socio-political and economic system, right? And that alienation is something that we see there with Pluto and Aquarius, right? And it's also something that is there within Uranus and Gemini, because the overall culture of the United States is really coming to see that this Faustian or pseudo-Faustian monstrosity that has been built on top of us is actually evil as fuck, right? And then furthermore, this whole thing is directly related to secret societies, this idea that these oligarchs constitute this hidden secret world which exists completely outside of the law that is very Saturn-Neptune coded. And all of these things are converging right now where we've got this pair of eclipses in Aquarius and Virgo. What's happening right now is the end of the Faustian age, the age of Virgo. What's happening right now is the collapse of the pseudo-Faustian American empire, American Faustianism. And ultimately, this is going to be extremely disruptive in all sorts of ways. This is not pretty by any stretch of the imagination, but luckily I'm here to tell you guys that there's actually a silver lining somewhere in all of this. So let's try to get to that now. So the first thing of note on the sunshine and rainbows list is that I don't think that this is going to result in a civil war or the breakdown of the United States federal government or a world war. Hopefully, it does look like there could be some kind of international conflict that comes out of all these different forces converging with one another, but hopefully that won't be as bad as it could potentially be. But in any case, there are a couple of reasons why I don't think a civil war is going to happen in particular, despite how many people seem to be suggesting that. And despite the fact that Neptune entering Aries is exactly what happened during the American Civil War. But in any case, I don't think that's where this is going for a few reasons. The first reason is that I simply do not see the level of ground level cultural divide that would be needed for something like that. There's much ado made in the media about how divided people are and how, you have these extremes of the political spectrum that can't really get along. And if your perception of the culture of the United States is coming from Twitter, then you're probably going to think something like that. But if you actually go out in the real world and talk to normal people, I think you get a very different impression. I actually think that we're all kind of more or less on the same page, actually more so perhaps than we've ever been. Most ordinary Americans can sit around and, drink a couple of beers and talk about politically charged issues. And, there will be disagreements, but I just do not see anything remotely like the kind of ideological and cultural divide that would be needed for people to start just murdering each other. Certainly not in the way that we saw during the American Civil War, where you really did have essentially two completely different nations at that point. Our culture is nothing like that right now, despite how much those in the media would perhaps like us to believe that that is the case. I really just don't think that it is. So, then the next reason why I don't think something like that is going to happen is because I don't think that this is a matter of everything just kind of flying off the rails in the way that it did during the 19th century American Civil War. Rather, I think that in a lot of ways, this is actually a kind of controlled demolition of sorts. And to understand why I'm saying that, we're going to now need to go back to Saturn. Now, if you're familiar with Greek or Roman mythologies, then you're probably used to this idea that Jupiter or Zeus, Jovian gods, being regarded as the patriarch of the gods in general, that Jupiter represents the king of the gods, and so Jupiter therefore represents the principle or value or ideal which is considered most central for Jovian cultures. And that's not just Greece and Rome. You can see this in many cultures of the mythical age. But if we rewind a bit into the early Bronze Age, or even prior to that in the Copper Age, what we find is something where Saturn is regarded as the patriarch of the gods. To understand this, what we need to understand is that Saturn worship is a form of culture in which, first of all, child sacrifice is a core motif. And second of all, Saturn really represents conservatism, regarded as the ultimate ideal. early agricultural civilizations are living on a razor's edge. They are trying to survive in this lifestyle that really human beings are not designed for. We are designed physiologically and I would say mentally as well to be persistence hunters. That's what we're good at. We chase down big game and we kill them and we eat them. The human body is not built for tilling soil. We are not biochemically designed to be herbivores. Okay, and so if you look at the early Neolithic period, the birth of sedentary agriculture, everything about human life, every measure of our well-being got pretty substantially worse. And that's a pretty good indication, I would say, that there was some sort of cataclysm which occurred, which brought on that agricultural revolution. It was not a great innovation. It was not something that we figured out because we were getting smarter. It was an act of desperation. So, Saturn then, being regarded as the chief deity, is something that makes a lot of sense within these early agricultural civilizations because these are societies in which any break of continuity with the past is a death sentence. If there's any change whatsoever in temperatures and rainfall and animal migration patterns, anything like that could result in everyone starving to death. And obviously these cultures don't want that, right? And so they prioritize that Saturnian necessity, continuity, the inertia of the past. They regarded that as the highest ideal because for them it was kind of the most important thing. And so this is where the whole child sacrifice thing comes into play, right? Because what's happening here is these people are sacrificing the future, represented by the sun, right? Sun, S-U-N or S-O-N, right? But these things are connected. The sun represents the mediation between present and future. And it also represents the values within the future, which kind of draw us forward. The sun is that which guides human beings into the future. That's really a good way of looking at it. And so within this child sacrifice, they're sacrificing firstborn sons, usually of nobility, firstborn sons of nobility, and there's a reason for that, to Saturn. So what they're doing is they're sacrificing the future to the past in order to appease the past, so that the continuity of the past will maintain itself. And what we really need to understand here is that this is not just superstition, right? This isn't just a magic these people were performing because they didn't understand how the world works and they thought that sacrificing these children would have that effect. No. They did that because it worked, right? When you have a royal family, okay, you've got the king and the queen, but then, you've got this extension where you have cousins and brothers and sisters. You have these royal families that are all kind of interrelated with one another. But the thing is, they all have different kind of rights to inheritance, right? So when the king dies, there's always going to be this issue of who inherits that, right? Whenever a patriarch dies, there's always going to be this issue of how to divide up his land or his money or what have you for his heirs. And so by engaging in this practice of child sacrifice of the sons of noble families, they actually are doing something that is ensuring that the past, the order of their society does not fragment, right? Because you're cutting down on the number of ways that the pie has to be divided, and it ensures that the fragmentation of that social order is actually less likely. And then in addition to that, there is also a transgressive aspect to this as well. There's hardly anything more transgressive than murdering firstborn sons, right? And recall what I was talking about earlier in this video, the way that these kind of collective ritualistic acts of transgression actually do serve to bind people together. And again, you can see that there's this very Saturnian aspect to that, the way that it facilitates stability, the way that it facilitates this interwoven solidity of a social order. So the thing is that over time, Saturn worship became less common, right? It began to die out during the Bronze Age. As life got generally easier for people, life was not so tumultuous that the conservation of the past was regarded as the ultimate value. And people started looking more towards the future as something that, hey, maybe we shouldn't sacrifice to the past, right? And so there's this transition that happens towards Jupiter worship, where now it's Jupiter, the patriarchal principle, which is now regarded as the highest value. But within the Mediterranean region, there was one culture form which retained this practice of Saturn worship, and the peoples who retained that aspect, that Saturnian aspect of their culture, those were the Semitic peoples. And so this is what we see with the Phoenicians, with the Canaanites, with the Carthaginians. We have to understand here that these people were hated by their neighbors in a way that is probably difficult for us to even imagine in the modern world. The Romans, generally speaking, did not try to exterminate people. They would conquer people, and, then their whole thing was, okay, you get to basically keep your culture and your gods or whatever you're into. As long as you pay us taxes, that's all that matters, right? With the Carthaginians, however, with the Punic Wars, that's not what happened. The Romans were on a mission to wipe the Carthaginians off of the face of the planet, and that is what they did. And we also see this in the Hebrew Bible, with the Hebrew war with the Canaanites, right? That was also a war of extermination. These people were despised in a way that is again, almost unimaginable for us. But what's really interesting with that example then is that the Hebrew people themselves were a Semitic culture. But they were a Semitic culture which really divided from other Semitic cultures like the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, specifically in that they rejected Saturn worship. They rejected these practices of child sacrifice. And so within the story of Abraham and Isaac, the binding of Isaac, this is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing an explicit rejection of the idea that the one true God of Israel is Saturn. Now, to be clear here, I am not saying that Saturn in itself, like the Saturnian principle, is inherently like evil or something like that. That's absolutely not the case. The Saturnian principle has a very important role to play in the composition of our world, because for freedom or complexity of any kind to be possible, then necessity is necessary. You need those stable foundations to build things upon. And so Saturn in itself is neutral, really, in the same way that all of these different principles are in themselves kind of neutral. But when Saturn is elevated to the position of being the highest principle, when Saturn is regarded as the all-father, as it were, that's when things get really, really ugly. So the Hebrews are defining themselves, really coming into existence as a coherent culture form precisely by defining themselves in contrast to the Semitic cultures which they were once a part of. And they're doing that precisely by rejecting Saturn worship and these practices of Saturn worship. And that's significant here because, first of all, this is just a very general process. This is how things really come into being, is by defining themselves against that which they are separating from. There's the formation of a kind of boundary, right? So we see this in biological birth. We also see it with teenagers rebelling against their parents, that kind of thing, right? We see it in science, the way that early modern science defined itself in contrast to religious dogma as a way of establishing itself in such a way that it has its own identity and ethos, right? And that's what we see in Jewish culture and the way that Judaism came about in contrast to these other Semitic Saturnian cultures. Now, what's particularly interesting here about the Jewish people and what makes them so central within the history of not only Western civilization, but really the history of the world, is that when they transitioned away from Saturn worship, they did not transition to Jupiter worship. Yahweh is not Jupiter. Yahweh is actually a kind of grammatical euphemism for Eya, right? I am. That's what the burning bush tells Moses. That's the one time within the Hebrew Bible that the one true God of Israel actually tells us his name. Tell them I am sent you, right? And so that is really significant here, because what that indicates actually is that the Jewish people are actually the torchbearers for a very specific metaphysical insight, which I really believe that they were carrying forward from the antediluvian or Atlantean era. They were the bearers of that in a way that other cultures were not. This I amness as really soul is something that you really only see within Jewish culture. And even there, it wasn't really explicit. Saying the name Eya as the name of God was considered extremely taboo. It was only the high priests within the temple during very specific ceremonies that they could actually utter Eya, I am, right? Otherwise, euphemisms had to be used. Adonai and Yahweh and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, the significance here is that this metaphysical insight, that the recursive loop of human subjectivity, the I, is this kind of ultimate spark of divinity, right? It really is the way that the apeiron, the way that Brahman, let's say, becomes a world at all, right? That is something that was kind of retained kind of beneath the surface within Judaism, and that spark, as it were, would eventually become Christianity, right? And you actually see foreshadowing of this within like the story of Enoch becoming Metatron, right? But in any case, the point here is that the Jews are defining themselves in contrast to the Saturn worshipers, right? And that's very significant here, because when anything defines itself in contrast to something else, then it's setting up its own identity in such a way that it is kind of priming itself to undergo a kind of inversion. Okay, and so we can see this within science, for example. Scientism is a fantastic example of this. Like I said, science really achieved its own sense of identity by defining itself in contrast to religious dogma, right? Science was supposed to be this thing where you could go out and look and see what was going on in the world with your own eyes. You did not have to rely on the authority of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or the church or whatever. You could come to your own conclusions about this, because really the truth of nature is actually at our fingertips. It's actually right here within our own empirical experience of the world. That is a radically Protestant idea, first of all. And it is radically individualistic in a lot of ways. It's radically anti-authoritarian in a lot of ways. Okay, but ultimately what happened to science, as science kind of lost contact with its own underlying logos, its own driving ethos, science underwent enantiodromia. Okay, that's a term that I'm kind of broadening from the way that Carl Jung uses it, but basically the way that I'm using it, I'm using it to refer to the way that things kind of turn themselves inside out, the way that they kind of mutate into their opposites. And within science, this is very, very blatant at this point, the way that modern academic science has essentially become a kind of ecclesiarchy, a kind of clerical class, where scientific no longer means that which you are actually arriving at by kind of coming to your own conclusions, by drawing from your own experience, but rather it's this kind of body of authorized beliefs. The clergy has to tell you what things are okay to believe because they're science, and what things are not okay to believe because they're pseudoscience, right? And of course, if you start looking into what exactly constitutes the difference between science and pseudoscience, what it ultimately boils down to is science is what the academics tell you is okay to believe, and pseudoscience is everything else. So in any case, point being here is that this is a great example of this sort of inversion that I'm talking about. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we can see this exact same kind of inversion within Judaism. So the Jewish people historically have kind of had a rough time for all kinds of reasons. One very important reason they had such a rough time during the Middle Ages is because of the way that the Romans kind of mythologized the story of Christ and the Jewish role in that in order to kind of get themselves off the hook by kind of reframing the story in such a way that it was really the Jews who killed Jesus. The Romans could then kind of wash their hands of that, but Of course, if you really read between the lines, I think it's quite obvious that it was actually the Romans who did that. It wasn't as though the Romans were like, oh, I'm not sure if I want to kill him or not, and then somehow, for some reason, the will of the Jewish people is what caused them to make the decision to crucify the guy. No, the Romans crucified him because they saw him as a rebel who was spreading dangerous ideas which were directly antithetical to the authority of Rome, and they killed anybody who did that. So why would they not kill him, right? Why would they, stay their hand on that decision until, the Jewish people, were like, kill him? Like, that's definitely not what actually happened, but nonetheless, that story stuck, because the Romanized version of Christianity found it very politically expedient in order to kind of justify the parasitic blending of Rome with Christianity, which began to occur during the final centuries of the Roman Empire. So that then is very significant insofar as it meant that the Jewish people were always this kind of scapegoat group throughout the Middle Ages. And ultimately, that would become what we see during the Renaissance period, in which, specifically because of their outsider status, Jews would come to fill this role of financiers, of bankers, right? So it's absolutely the case that throughout European history, the Jews were very often abused and persecuted, specifically because they were this kind of outsider group. And so they were acceptable targets in a lot of ways. And the really dark part of all of this is the fact that collective trauma tends to bind people together. And unfortunately, it tends to bind people together in ways that are actually extremely misanthropic, frankly. People who are bound together by collective trauma tend to see themselves as being a group set in contrast to the world, and that no one else can be trusted, right? It's actually not all that different, frankly, than like what we saw earlier with the Spartans killing the Helots as this kind of initiation ritual that binds people together through transgression. You would think that it would be a little bit differently if you are the ones being transgressed against, right? Like if there's this outsider group killing my people or what have you, then it wouldn't have quite the same effect, but it's really the exact same thing, and it really brings out these primal Dionysian forces in much the exact same way, and it does result in this kind of misanthropic kind of coldness to anyone that's in an outside group who is perceived as being other. And it creates this kind of very insular, very ethnic sense of self-identity. And so with that, you then have the stage set for the emergence of the modern banking system, the kind of global financial system that would eventually emerge through the ascent of these extremely wealthy Jewish banking families. And what we have to keep in mind here is that the Jewish people who were a part of that world, of these super elites, these are people who very often saw themselves as part of a kind of superhuman group that was above other people. And that is not just me speculating. If you want examples of that, they can be found. And I should probably make it clear here that I am not saying these things in order to push some sort of anti-Semitic agenda. I definitely don't believe that people of Jewish ancestry are like inferior to other people in some kind of way. The fact that I even have to say that is frankly kind of silly. But my point here is that we can see that there was the gestation of actually an extremely toxic kind of worldview within specifically the highest echelons of Jewish society, which were involved within this kind of global banking system that came to emerge and came to really flourish and rise to power following the birth of modernity during the Renaissance. So we should look at this within the context of what I've been calling enantiodromia, or what Rudolf Steiner would call Umstülpung. It's a German word that I'm almost definitely mispronouncing, but it means something like turning inside out. And what we're seeing here is that with these extremely wealthy, largely Jewish financier families, is that they are undergoing a kind of inversion into a perverse mirror image of themselves. Why? Well, because that is what always happens when any kind of spiritual impulse, any kind of current of life loses contact with its own underlying ethos, its own guiding light. It always mutates into a parody of itself, into a perverse mirror image of itself. And for Judaism, we know what that is, because we know exactly how Judaism came to initially define itself. It defined itself in contrast to Semitic Saturn worship and child sacrifice. And so when Judaism comes to mutate in that way, in that inverting sort of way, it becomes Saturn worship. So, one aspect of this either explicit or implicit Saturn worship is the deification of these titanic global financial systems of domination and control, of stabilization, of ordering the world, right? And then on the other hand, you have the child sacrifice aspect of this, which we see, of course, brought to light in the most horrifying way imaginable by this whole Epstein scandal. And, of course, another aspect of this is the ritualized crossing of the threshold between the diurnal world that we ordinarily inhabit within normal waking consciousness, and then this kind of sub-Saturnian world of the unconscious, of these primal forces, right? And it's also important to keep in mind here that this culture form that has come about through this mutation of the Jewish culture form is not strictly about people of Jewish ethnicity whatsoever. I mean, there are clearly like many people who are a part of this thing within the highest echelons of the modern world order who are not Jewish at all. This is not something that's strictly bound by ethnicity at all, really. But nonetheless, it is also true that Israel would appear to be the nucleus of this global finance empire, which has been growing steadily for the past 250 years at bare minimum. And so I think that what's happening right now in a lot of ways when we look to the United States and all of the disruption that's occurring, all of the ways in which it seems like the American empire is collapsing, what we're seeing is a massive shift in the epicenter of world power. The United States empire was kind of like the last bastion of national imperialism following the end of the colonial epoch. But that era is now coming to an end, and that's why I think in a lot of ways what's happening in the United States right now is a kind of controlled demolition, because the new epicenter of world power is going to be Jerusalem, and Jerusalem as specifically the central nucleus of this world global financial empire. And so that then brings us to my last major point here, which is that the crowning of this new empire really represents a recapitulation of Atlantean civilization, which sounds probably a bit woo-woo, but let's look at the different things that are pointing to that. Saturn, obviously, we've already talked about that quite a bit, but also Neptune. The Greeks tell us that the chief god of the Atlanteans was Neptune, interestingly, not Saturn. It was after the end of the Atlantean epoch, after the deluge, that Saturn worship really came to prominence, because there was this deification of that state of the world in which everything was stable repetition, right? There was this big rupture of that, and then human beings, the human beings who survived that and began early sedentary civilization, they were the ones who began worshiping Saturn and talking about the golden age of Saturn in reference to that antediluvian epoch. But the Atlanteans themselves, they worshipped Neptune as their chief god. Right, and so that's another reason why the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, I believe, is so immensely significant here. Now, another aspect of this would be the way that Mesoamerican civilization fits into the big picture here. Rudolf Steiner, interestingly, says a number of very interesting things about Mesoamerican civilization, actually, but one of the most interesting things he says is that Mesoamerican civilization was, in a lot of ways, a kind of vestige of Atlantean civilization. And I think he's right about that for a number of reasons. So, right now, we have turned our phones, our black mirrors, into Mesoamerican obsidian scrying mirrors, right? Just like the one that John Dee used for divinatory practices. I don't think that's an accident. I think there is a recurrence of motifs that is happening here. Another thing that Steiner says that's very interesting, he says that in modern American civilization, the civilization of the United States, and he's referring to the late 19th, early 20th century, the time period in which the United States was undergoing this very rapid industrialization. Steiner says that the industrial power that we see in the United States is actually performing the exact same spiritual function performed by Aztec human sacrifice. Now, that might seem a bit odd. It might not be terribly obvious how those two things are related, but I think Steiner's actually right about this. And the reason why is because, as we've already examined to some degree, the Aztec practices of human sacrifice were all about really creating this kind of collectivistic sense of identity, which was, very primal, very driven by the Arenies, the Furies, right? Bringing those kind of chthonic Dionysian powers out in order to bind people together and create these super soldiers, effectively. And what we're seeing with industrial technology in the United States, there actually is, I think, a commonality there insofar as the industrialization of the United States, the factories, the assembly lines, the replaceable parts or interchangeable parts, how these things also serve this purpose of kind of eroding the individualized sense of human selfhood in favor of this very kind of hive mind sort of thing, right? And there's a paradox there, of course, because the United States is culturally generally considered to be hyper-individualistic, and that's true, but it's also true, I think, that the industrial might of the United States, that the effect that it has on a psychological level is very much about breaking down that individuality by turning people into cogs within the great machine, as it were, right? And this is something that we see even now with the cookie cutter suburbs, right, where every house looks exactly the same, the office buildings where everybody has to sit in a cubicle, right, and the black cube and all that. There's definitely a continuity there, I would say. And moreover, I think that what's going on here is that we're seeing that this new kind of empire that is emerging right now is going to be in a lot of ways a recapitulation of the Atlantean empire, precisely in the way that it is really oriented towards breaking down the human ego, the human sense of individual identity, in favor of these much more collectivistic forms of identity. Virtually everything about the modern world, about modern culture, seems to be oriented towards the infantilization of the human being, towards making sure that we are very disempowered in relation to a world that is too complicated for us to really understand and much bigger than what we feel like we can really grasp intellectually, let alone pragmatically. And then you have artificial intelligence as well, which is further accelerating this infantilization, this failure of the human ego to become self-empowered in the way that it normally would. And all of that is a very big deal because as our development as egos comes to be further and further forestalled and malformed, we are going to become much more susceptible to whatever collectivistic spirits might act upon us. And furthermore, we're also going to become much more inclined towards whatever sources of security and safety and comfort are available to us. We're going to be much more inclined towards sheltering ourselves within our addictions, within our video games, within pornography, or our religious dogmatism for that matter. All of our devices are now being used to harvest enormous amounts of data on our habits, our inclinations, the way that we think, our personalities, our mental quirks, or whatever the case may be. And of course, this is all going to be used for marketing, but that alone is the most benign possible use case for all this. Now with artificial intelligence in the picture, what artificial intelligence really represents from the perspective of a global financial empire is the power to control human populations with very surgical precision by changing what people believe, by changing people's perceptions of what is even going on in reality. And so we need to be very careful with that, because essentially anything that we see is going to be something that we are seeing because we are being allowed to see it. Whatever we think is going to be something that we are being allowed to think. We might feel a bit safer right now because it seems like, oh, all of the conspiracy theories have turned out to be true. We've pulled back the veil. Surely none of this is being orchestrated from the top, right? But again, think about it. Think about the Epstein thing. Think about the fact that if the Department of Justice really wanted to just make this all go away, they could have. There's something more at work here, and I'm not entirely sure what it is, but we need to be very careful with that. In any case, my point here is that there is a motif here. There is a theme that is accelerating right now, and that theme is the infantilization of the individual human ego and the way that that is going to result in a kind of regression into this kind of animistic, shamanic mode of consciousness, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about the Atlantean epoch. Saturn cultists in the Bronze Age were sacrificing firstborn sons to Saturn because, in a lot of ways, the sun, representing the individual self-concept, is the ultimate threat to Saturnian forms of stable, titanic order. right? And today, the greatest threat to the Saturnian powers that are currently ascending is likewise the individual sense of empowerment, the individual human ego, human individual identity. But if that individual identity is destabilized, deteriorated, disempowered, then human populations can potentially be controlled by data, by information, by social trends, by social contagions, in much the same way that social insects can be controlled by pheromones. This is all, needless to say, extremely dangerous. But whenever the pavement starts to crack and fragment, and this is the real silver lining of all this, whenever cracks start to form, there's always the possibility for something new to germinate and sprout forth. And so that brings us to the other flip side of the coin, that is the United States. One side, as we have already seen, is the kind of neo-pseudo-Faustian civilization that represents the American Empire. But on the other side of that coin, you have the actual organic culture form of the United States, of really North America as a whole. And the core motif of North American civilization is not the Faustian Spire. It's certainly not the Saturn V rockets. It's certainly not the skyscrapers of New York and Chicago. No. It is, I believe, the Thunderbird. And I believe that that motif is something that is present, though masked, within modern American society. We see it in lots of different ways. If we look back over the history of the United States, we see it in our obsession with aerospace technologies. We see it in the Wright brothers. We see it in Amelia Earhart. We see it in the fact that one of the final acts of the Biden administration before leaving office was declaring the eagle to finally be officially the bird of the United States. And that's all quite significant here. And of course, the Thunderbird is really a Native American or Amerindian cultural motif. The Thunderbird is kind of the Amerindian equivalent of Jupiter in certain ways, right? Thunder is, of course, a theme related to storm gods, and even Jovian deities like Jupiter and Zeus were usually associated with the eagle. And so This is interesting because the Thunderbird, it's not quite just simply a Jovian deity. It is, but it's also a little bit more than that. It's a little bit more specific than that. And here we have to understand really what the bird symbolizes. So for those of you who have been around on this channel for a really long time, you might remember some things that I pointed out in my video analysis of the film Angel's Egg, and how this theme, or really this whole symbolic landscape, is central to really humanity at large, I would say. You've got the world tree, and then you've got the serpent, and then you've got the eagle in the tree, or the egg in the tree, right? That is a very, very deeply rooted symbolic complex here. And so really what the bird represents is the human soul, right? It is an individual entity, okay, but it's an entity which is able to mediate between heavens and earth. The birds can fly, obviously, right? And so within Angel's Egg, that film, assuming you haven't seen it, it's a pretty good watch. It's kind of an ambient film, but in any case, the egg is very clearly representing the soul in a state of dormancy, as it were. But in any case, this is something that we see in many different cultures, birds kind of representing the flight of the soul, or the desire for freedom, which issues forth from the soul. And so with the Thunderbird then, what is that? Well, the Thunderbird is a Jovian soul. It is an individual human subjectivity which has become the Father, right? Now, of course, Amerindian cultures probably wouldn't have put it that way. That was really not something that was possible to even conceptualize prior to really now in human history. And so there's something rather spooky about all this, right? The Amerindian peoples would not have seen the Thunderbird as representing this kind of theosis of the human ego, really. But nonetheless, I think that is ultimately the significance of the Thunderbird within this entire evolutionary process, which is the development of human consciousness, the ascension of the human subject, the human ego, and that really amounts to the completing of the incarnation of the human soul. So if you watch my last video essay, The Envisionary Ego, the Soul of the Future, then you're probably starting to see how all these dots connect. You have this process that involves the death of the father, the collapse of the form languages that we are embedded in, the collapse of nuclear families, the collapse of really masculinity in general, and the collapse of the religious institutions and political institutions which bestowed upon us the order needed for the sustenance and perpetuation of human life. All of those things have kind of disintegrated, and ultimately what that then demands of us is becoming the Father, right? All of this is contained there within the gestures of the story of Christ's crucifixion. The crucifixion and the eclipse represent the collapse of the human ego into a kind of solipsistic abandonment by the Father God, by the principle represented by the Father God and the manifestations of that principle within human cultures, right? And then the end of the story is theosis. It is becoming the Father. Well, what is that? Well, that is achieving the internalization of the creative power of the Jovian principle, the power to unify, and through unifying, creating form, creating harmony. That's really what that patriarchal principle represents. And so by internalizing that power, by incorporating really the right cerebral hemisphere's creative power into the human ego, into our capacity to act voluntarily upon the world, what we're doing is we're achieving a power to conceptualize, to actually create new forms, new concepts, to create new kinds of collective identity through which we can bring ourselves together into communities that are not necessarily bound together by blood and soil, but rather by a shared sense of destiny. And so we will be coming to, hopefully, achieve the power to create a new culture, which is a radically new thing within human history, because up until this point, culture was something that created us. Physiologically, psychologically, in terms of our habits and the way that we navigate the world. All of that was conditioned, was formed by that Jovian principle, which really acted upon us from above. It was there in our religious institutions, in our schools, in our political institutions, in our cultural norms, and all of that has fallen apart. And it's very tempting to look at that as a degenerative process, as a kind of decay, because in a sense it is, but it's also serving a purpose. It's serving the purpose of forcing us to find that power within ourselves so as to create a new kind of world. And so when we look to the way that human creative power has expanded drastically over the course of the past 500 years, that's really what we're seeing. Our capacity to create new ideas, to create new religions even, to create fantasy worlds. These things are not just superficial after effects. They're actually coming from the same place. They're coming from a power that the human being is currently internalizing, which up until very recently in human history has always acted upon us from the outside. And that is the process that we see at every stage of this historical development. That which was once outside is now brought inside. And this internalization is particularly immensely significant because it is through this process that we actually have to effectively become masters of our own destiny and create a new kind of society. We have to recreate ourselves, we have to recreate our families, and we kind of have to do it from scratch in a way that no one has ever had to do it before. And that's gonna be a lot easier said than done. The modern world has really fucked us all up pretty bad, psychologically speaking. We are all total train wrecks in terms of our internal composition, and what we're ultimately going to have to do is we're going to have to use that unifying power, the power to orchestrate, the power to harmonize, in order to recreate ourselves, first of all, to kind of redeem ourselves, our past trauma, our weird fixations, whatever the case may be. We have to harmonize our inner workings into something coherent and healthy, and then we have to harmonize each other into new forms of social organization that can stand as an alternative to the death world that is being erected around us. Now, that all might seem rather pie in the sky because in a sense it kind of is. Nothing I'm saying here or suggesting is particularly new. In fact, utopianism has been one of the most consistent recurring motifs within the history of the United States. I mean, going all the way back to the very beginning, the founding of the United States was really a kind of utopian endeavor which was attempting to separate itself from the Faustian British Empire, and then it didn't quite play out that way because of the influence of the Rothschilds, among others, but that's a whole other narrative I'm not going to get into right now. But following that, you also had the 19th century utopian movements and even 18th century utopian movements where people would go off into uncharted territory and start or attempt to start a new kind of society based on usually some kind of religious principles. Usually the people who did that were religious fanatics, frankly, of some form or another. The Puritans were absolutely that. And then fast forward into the 20th century, you see the exact same thing with the hippies, trying to do the exact same thing, starting these communes, trying to create some kind of new world that can actually be based on love and peace and having a better relationship with the environment and yada, 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 right? And it usually has gone really, really badly for all kinds of reasons. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons why that has almost always failed right now. You can look into it if you want to. There's a lot of different stories to be told in that vein. And of course, a lot of people would look to that and say, well, it's just impossible. It just can't be done. And I don't think that it is. In fact, I think it can be done, and I think ultimately it's going to be necessary for human beings to actually get together and say, okay, we actually have to create something new now. We have to try to actually create a new kind of culture that can be something genuinely separate from this great matrix vampire machine around us. And we really need to think long and hard about what exactly that would take, about what exactly would make that realistic. There's a lot of counterexamples. I certainly know that's the case. Most attempts to do this kind of thing don't go very well, or they end up fizzling out for one reason or another. Usually you'll have something like, a bunch of very idealistic hippies who get together, and there'll be one crazy rich person who finances the whole thing, and they'll buy a plot of land and try to figure out how to, grow potatoes or whatever. And of course, nothing really impressive has ever come out of that. But nonetheless, I think the impulse towards doing that kind of thing has been coming from a very real place. I don't think it's just been a bunch of delusional people with delusional fantasies. I think there actually is a kind of destiny which has been pulling us forward, and we've never really been able to effectively act upon that because we just have not had the equipment, as it were, to actually do that. And I think that that's actually starting to change. I think the pieces are beginning to fall into place, which can allow us to actually create a new kind of culture for the first time. So to make a very long story short, I think that's ultimately what the Thunderbird represents. It represents the culture form of North America, and it represents the destiny, really, of the American spirit, which is the realization of the first phase, at least, of what I've called the envisionary ego, the envisionary structure of consciousness, right? And I don't know if we're going to see the birth of a new kind of envisionary human civilization within our lifetimes. It could take a while. It could take a while because, again, there's a lot of prerequisites which have to be met. We've got to be able to turn the telescope around and look within ourselves and really reconfigure ourselves in such a way that something like that can actually be possible. But I think it's part of the trajectory here. And so I think that the downfall of the United States empire, even though it is, on the one hand, setting the stage for this global financial empire, the fragmentation of that pseudo-Faustian American empire is also going to be opening up some doors, opening up some possible pathways towards the realization of something new. So there's probably about a dozen different topics that I was going to mention within this video that I've forgotten about or don't really have time to get into that much. So I'm definitely going to be trying to make a follow-up to this as well. And so stay tuned for that, guys. Thanks for watching and all that. And we're just going to keep continuing to dive deeper and deeper into all this because that's what we do here. I've got a couple of other very big projects on my plate at the moment, one of which is the next video essay in the alleged EPO series. There's going to be at least 2 more of those. And then another super secret project that I haven't told you guys about. So keep an eye on the channel and I will see you guys around. Toodles.